reply to a debate that the honourable gentleman and other colleagues spoke in a couple of weeks ago on exploring the potential for restoring the Rosyth to Zeebrugge link, which for commercial reasons ceased operating a few years ago. I think there are lots of potentials for reopening that. It primarily is a matter for the Scottish Government, but I'm happy to work with him and his colleagues to explore all these opportunities.
The Minister, Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ScotWind allocation announced last week has the opportunity to create thousands of jobs in Scotland. The reality is that over their time in office, the SNP has created lots of highly skilled jobs. It's just they're not in Scotland. They're in China, Poland, Portugal and elsewhere. The Scottish Government failed to put in place sufficient demands for local procurement as part of awarding the contracts. It's particularly disappointing for coastal communities who can see offshore wind turbines being installed, but they can't see the jobs. What discussion has the Minister had with the Scottish Government about ensuring that the supply chain for ScotWind creates jobs in Scotland and across the UK?
Minister.
Well, I agree with the basic point the Honourable Lady is making, and if I can reference back to the answer I gave to the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland, if you look at the whole piece of renewable energy, there are enormous opportunities to develop that technology in Scotland through our contracts for difference round, which is as big as all the other rounds put together. There is huge investment going in offshore wind and in tidal, and I will continue to explore every avenue to make sure that this country is able to secure the lion's share of that industrial capacity.
Emily's waving.
Yes. Susan Webb.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, 8 projects in Scotland have received a share of over £170 million from round 1 of the Levelling Up Fund. These projects will create new jobs, boost training, grow productivity and deliver tremendous economic benefit to Scotland.
Mr. Speaker, with all the news on the Levelling Up White Paper today, could my right honourable friend update the House on progress towards launching the fund's second round, as I know within many bidders in Scotland, as there will be in my constituency of Stourbridge, where we are keen to move forward with a bid to regenerate Lye.
Mr. Speaker, unsuccessful applicants who passed the gateway stage will be offered feedback to support future bids, and they will also be encouraged to reapply. Round 2 of the Levelling Up Fund is due to open in the spring of this year, and there will be more information shared in due course.
Davis Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I feel for the Minister for having to come to the dispatch box to defend his government's appalling record on spending for the devolved nations. Their broken promises on fully replacing EU funds look to set Wales over £1 billion over the next few years. So can the Minister confirm exactly how the government plan on plugging this gap? The Shared Prosperity Fund will see all of the devolved nations lose out on vital funding, and it is simply not good enough.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to be absolutely clear, regarding funding to the devolved administrations, the first point I'd make to the Honourable Lady is that the settlement for Scotland this year, £41.6 billion, is an increase of £4 billion. It's the highest settlement the Scottish Government have received since 1998, so since devolution began. And regarding the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, the ERDF and ESF funds are being absolutely replaced with no reduction whatsoever, as per our manifesto commitment.
David Dewitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend explain to the House or inform us of what engagement he's had and other UK government departments have had with the Scottish Government and in particular local authorities in Scotland to ensure that levelling up is truly a levelling up exercise across the whole United Kingdom?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as my honourable friend knows, we have had, when he was in the Scotland office with me, we've had a lot of engagement with Scottish local authorities, and we have been very clear that we are going to deliver the levelling up money and work with those local authorities to practice real devolution.
Ray Morris.
Number 7, sir.
Minister.
The Union Connectivity Review recognised the importance of the A1 and recommended that the UK Government should seek to work with the Scottish Government to develop an assessment of the East Coast Road and Rail Corridor. We will respond to the UCR and publish that in due course.
Thank the Minister for that response, but on the day that the Levelling Up agenda has been published, can he tell the House what steps he's taking to devolve powers and finance to the northern region so that we can strengthen ties with the Holyrood government, independent of Westminster, and so increase rail capacity, increase trade and opportunities for business?
Minister.
Well, first of all, I should say I know how passionate the honourable gentleman is about transport matters. I had the pleasure of serving with him on the Transport Select Committee for a number of years. I think if he reads through the Levelling Up white paper, which came out today, I appreciate it's quite a weighty tome, so may not have had a chance to digest it all yet, but he will see in that the measures to which he's referring. That we can encourage better connectivity between the different economic centres of the UK. And I would be absolutely delighted to see a strengthening of that corridor between Scotland and the north east of England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 9, please, sir. 9.
Secretary of State.
My office and I have regular discussions with the Ministry of Defence on all matters relating to defence in Scotland, including defence investment with industry and commerce in Scotland, which totalled almost £2 billion in 2020-2021.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scotland is home to the Royal Navy Submarine Service, including our essential independent nuclear deterrent that protects the whole of the UK. As President Putin continues to escalate his military posture and the aggression on the Ukrainian border. And let's be clear, it is President Putin escalating this and not the Russian people. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that our commitment to defence investment in Scotland, including Trident, is important, indeed vital, to Scotland's security as part of the UK and as part of NATO?
I need to finish these questions. Please, it's in good order that you want to hear your own Secretary of State. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, you won't be surprised to hear that I completely agree with my honourable friend. The UK's independent nuclear deterrent, which is Trident based at the HMS Naval Base Clyde, exists to deter the most extreme threats to the United Kingdom, but also to our NATO allies. Our nuclear deterrent is the ultimate assurance against current and future threats and remains essential for as long as the global security situation demands.
Alan Smith, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 10, please.
This government has consistently said the best way to support people's living standards is through good work, better skills and higher wages. Our plan for jobs is working. The economy is growing and unemployment is low. The national living wage and universal credit taper and allowance changes are putting more money in people's pockets.
Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK energy market is demonstrably broken. Surely that's of concern to all of us on all sides of the House. Now, I'm particularly concerned about rural energy prices and disparities between urban and rural areas. Competition law and energy law are reserved to this place. Would the Minister support my call for an investigation into uncompetitive energy practices? And if he won't, would he care to come to the City of Stirling and explain to the people of Stirling and Scotland how the UK energy market is working for them?
Minister.
Well, first of all, can I welcome the honourable gentleman's home city and its City of Culture bid. And I'm always happy to come and visit Stirling. In fact, I believe I'm coming up in the next couple of weeks to visit. I'm very happy to meet him to discuss the measures he refers to. But I would point out that energy prices are rising globally. That is a consequence of the coronavirus restrictions easing and demand coming back, together with other geopolitical factors. So I would put the points he raises in that global context.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I wish to make a statement about the House practices regarding accusing members of lying or deliberately misleading the House. I recognise there are frustrations around the House's practices. Firstly, let me say that there are means by which accusations of lying may be brought before the House, including by means of a substantive motion. The Scottish National Party did so on their opposition day in November. However, members may not accuse each other of lying or deliberately misleading the House unless such a substantive motion is under consideration. Erskine May is clear that it is to preserve the character of parliamentary debate, which I take to mean to stop it descending into fruitless cycles of accusation and counter-accusation. May I also say that expressions when used in respect of the members, which are regarded with particular seriousness, generally leading to prompt intervention from the Chair and often a requirement on a member to withdraw the words, include charges uttering deliberate falsehoods. It is important to stress context. Similar words said in different proceedings might attract a different response from the Chair, depending on the subject being debated, tone and other considerations, but in general the Chair will not tolerate accusations of lying or deliberately misleading the House. That is the long-standing practice of the House, as set out in Erskine May and followed by successive speakers and deputy speakers. Of course, long-standing practices may change. For example, if the House decided it wanted a different approach, perhaps informed by the Procedure Committee inquiry, but it's not for me to change the practice unilaterally. Therefore, I ask members to respect this approach. I know feelings run high on important issues we discuss, but there are plenty of ways of making strong feelings felt within the rules and without placing the Chair in the invidious position of having to order members to withdraw on seeking their suspension. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I'd like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. I now call Esther McVeigh.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this Sunday, Her Majesty the Queen will become the first British monarch to celebrate a Platinum Jubilee. While it is a moment for national celebration, it will be a day of mixed emotions for Her Majesty, as, of course, the day also marks 70 years since the death of her beloved father, George VI. I know that the whole House will want to join me in thanking Her Majesty for her tireless service. We look forward to celebrating her historic reign with a series of national events in June. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Esther McVeigh.
On Monday, the Secretary of State for Health said mandatory vaccinations would be subject to a consultation. So can the Prime Minister make it clear, unequivocally, no ifs, no buts, no qualifications, that mandatory vaccinations for NHS staff will be abandoned? Will he also make it clear that is true for care workers as well, many of whom have already lost their jobs? So what support will the government be giving to get those care workers back into the care sector, and will those who've lost their jobs get compensation?
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much for her thoughtful work on this. I want to stress that vaccines remain our best line of defence, and I do think that NHS staff and all those who work in the care sector have a professional responsibility to get vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. But as my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, told the House on Monday, given the difference between Omicron and Delta, it is right, and she is right, that we revisit the balance of risks and opportunities, Mr. Speaker. The Health Secretary has said we'll launch a consultation, and subject to the responses and the will of this House, Mr. Speaker, the government will revoke the regulations.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And following your opening remarks, I just want to say to the members opposite Theirs is the party of Winston Churchill. Our parties stood together as we defeated fascism in Europe. Now their leader stands in the House of Commons parroting the conspiracy theories of violent fascists to try and score cheap political points. He knows exactly what he is doing. It's time to restore some dignity. Mr. Speaker, one of the most absurd claims made on behalf of Operation Save Big Dog is the Prime Minister and the Chancellor writing in the Sunday Times that they are the tax-cutting Conservatives. Why do these alleged tax cutters keep raising taxes on working people?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on his first point, I don't want to make heavy weather of this, but I am informed that in 2013, the right honourable gentleman apologised and took full responsibility for what had happened on his watch. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that was the right thing to do. And Mr. Speaker, on what we're doing to tackle cost of living and taxation, Mr. Speaker, our COVID recovery plan is absolutely vital in helping people with the cost of living, lifting up universal credit payments, Mr. Speaker, by cutting the tax that people effectively pay, lifting the living wage, Mr. Speaker, helping councils with another £500 million for those who are facing particular hardship, Mr. Speaker. But what we're also doing, and this is absolutely vital, is increasing the number of high-wage, high-skill jobs in this country. 420,000 more on the payroll than there were before the pandemic began, because we've had the fastest exit from COVID of any European economy, Mr. Speaker, because we had the fastest vaccine and booster rollout.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just the national insurance rise. Thresholds for income tax frozen, a stealth tax on working people. The threshold for tuition fees frozen, a stealth tax on working people. Local authorities forced to increase council tax, a stealth tax on working people. You can be as stealthy as you like, but you can't hide reality. We have the highest tax burden for 70 years during the middle of an inflation crisis. So I ask the Prime Minister again, why do he and the Chancellor keep raising taxes on working people?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is helping people with the cost of living, cutting taxes for those on universal credit, Mr. Speaker, as I have said. Helping people with the cost of their fuel, Mr. Speaker, with the cold weather payments, the warm homes payments, Mr. Speaker, doing all the things that this country would expect, lifting the living wage, which this party, Mr. Speaker, introduced. This government has increased by the record amount, Mr. Speaker. And above all, the most important thing that we are doing is helping people into work. 500,000 people off welfare into work under our Way to Work scheme. More people in work now than before the pandemic began, and that is the record of this government. Labour, never forget, Mr. Speaker, there's never been a Labour government that left office with unemployment lower than when they entered. Check that out, Mr.
Keir Starmer. Lots of words, lots of bluster, no answers. Word of warning. Word of warning, Prime Minister. That's not going to work with the police. I'll tell him why they're putting taxes up. Low growth. In the decade of Tory government before the pandemic, growth slumped. It was much, much weaker than under the last Labour government. If the Tories matched our record on growth, we would have £30 billion more to spend on public services without having to raise a single tax. Mr. Speaker, surely even this Prime Minister doesn't need someone else to tell him that he and the Chancellor are having to raise taxes because the Tories failed to grow the economy over a decade.
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, I think everybody in this country can see that we've been through the biggest pandemic since for 100 years, that that we've looked after the people of this country to the tune of £400 billion that we've put into furlough and all the other schemes. 11.7 million people protected. Everybody knows the cost of that, Mr. Speaker. And at the same time, in spite of all the difficulties that we have faced, we have now got the fastest growth in the G7. Absolutely true. We've got youth unemployment. We've got youth unemployment at a record low, Mr. Speaker. We've got 3 times as much tech investment coming into this country as there is in France, twice as much as there is in Germany. Yes, that's absolutely true, Mr. Speaker. And never forget, if you want to know about Labour economics, never forget the last time they were in office, Mr. Speaker, when they were finally booted out, they left a note saying there's no money left. That's the way they run the country, Mr. Speaker.
Here's Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the UK...
Some people won't be getting more because they won't be here to hear it, so Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the UK has suffered the worst economic crisis in the G7. The Prime Minister has more chance of persuading the public that he didn't hold any parties than he has of persuading them that the economy is booming. High taxes are not just the result of low growth. Under this government, we've seen a pandemic of waste and fraud. From the Prime Minister's yacht to government contracts for mates of ministers, they've treated taxpayers as an ATM machine for their mates and their lifestyles. Now we find, Mr. Speaker, they've written off £8.7 billion on PPA, and the Chancellor's writing off £4.3 billion in fraud. That's enough to cover the tax hike he's inflicting on working people. So why did this government block the National Crime Agency from investigating all the billions they lost to fraud?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, of course we despise fraud and those who steal from the taxpayer, and that's why we've already recovered £743 million in lost furlough money, Mr. Speaker, £2.2 billion that was stolen in bounce-back loans, and we will go on. But I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I am proud of what this government and this country did in securing record quantities of PPE and record time, Mr. Speaker, in furloughing and looking after the entirety of British business and society in the way that we did, Mr. Speaker. And once again, Captain Hindsight comes to this House and attacks the government for doing exactly what he urged us to do 18 months ago. Mr. Speaker, it so happens that I found a letter. I've been rustling in my notes, Mr. Speaker. And I found a letter which I will place for your convenience in the House, in the library of the House, Mr. Speaker, from the Shadow Chancellor to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Deluxe, suggesting that we could secure PPE supplies. This is on April the 22nd, 2020. Secure PPE supplies from from a theatrical costumier, and that we could get ventilators from a professional football agent, Mr. Speaker. No wonder under Labour, fraud was running at £21 billion per year, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud of what this government did to secure PPE, and I'm proud of the way we protected this country.
Keir Starmer. Who wants to be the first to leave? Please put your hand up, because I'm going to pick one of you. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister might want to sharpen how he answers questions under interview. He's going to need it in the next few weeks. Waste and low growth explain why we have high taxes, but they don't explain why it's always working people that are asked to pay more. Yesterday, he ordered his troops not to support a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. As a result, the country is missing out on over £1 billion we could have used to cut taxes on energy bills for working people. Today, he's ordering his troops to vote for tax cuts for banks. As a result, the country is missing out on another £1 billion we could have spent cutting taxes for working people. Why are the Chancellor and the Prime Minister protecting oil companies and bank profits while putting taxes up on working people?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, let's just get to the heart of what this is all about. this is all about dealing with the consequences of the biggest pandemic this country has seen, with an unprecedented economic crisis in which the state had to come forward and look after the people of this country to the tune of £408 billion. But everybody can see the fiscal impacts of that. Shall I tell you what this government and this country is voting for and what we're doing? We're investing now in 45,000 more NHS workers, more people in our NHS this year than there were last year. 10,000 more nurses, 10,900 more nurses, about 5,000 more doctors, 9 million more scans, 100 community diagnostics hubs to help people to get the scans and treatment they need. And the incredible thing, the lamentable thing is that the party opposite, the party of Nye Bevan, Mr. Speaker, voted against those funds, voted against that investment, and they would have made our COVID recovery impossible.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, for all the bluster, the truth is the Conservative Party are the party of high taxes because they're the party of low growth. They are the party of high taxes because they're the party of eye-watering waste. Mr. Speaker, we know this Prime Minister has no respect for decency or honesty. I can take it when it's aimed at me, but I won't accept it when he gaslights the British public, writing absurd articles about cutting taxes at a time when he's squeezing working people to the pips. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that he and his Chancellor are the Tory Thelma and Louise, hand in hand, as they drive the country off the cliff and into the abyss of low growth and tax?
Mr. Gullis, I think you've been trailed for long enough and you don't want to be trailed anymore. And that is the last comment I have, or otherwise I will ring your mother. Keir Starmer.
Isn't it true, Mr. Speaker, that he and the Chancellor are the Tory Thelma and Louise, hand in hand as they drive the country off the cliff and into the abyss of low growth and high tax?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman is Dick Dastardly and Muttley. Both of them pulling in different directions. We know they have different views, Mr. Speaker. We are getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker. And just in the last few days, and of course, I think it's absolutely extraordinary that they've done nothing to support our COVID recovery plan. They voted against our plans to support the NHS. But what we're doing, just in the last few days, while he's been fixated on the issues that he's absolutely determined to escalate, what we've done, we've opened free ports across the country just in the last few days. We're getting 500,000 people off welfare into work with our Way to Work plan. In just a few short minutes, Mr. Speaker, I hope he will hang around, because he will hear my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, deliver the long-awaited Levelling Up white paper, full of good stuff, including 55 education investment areas across our country. A wonderful moral and economic mission to level up and give opportunity across the whole country. A fantastic vision for this country, Mr. Speaker. They have nothing of the kind to offer the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, while we are getting on with coming out of COVID with the fastest economic recovery in the G7, the fastest. He would have kept us in lockdown, Mr. Speaker. We're fixing the NHS. We're fixing the NHS and social care when they voted against it, and they have no plan. And we are, well, Mr. Speaker, we are building a coalition. We are building a coalition.
Just a minute. Prime Minister, I'm this way, not that way. Maybe Specsavers might be the answer to see where I am. And can I just say, Dame Caroline Dinage is desperate to get the next question to you. Dame Diana Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to first of all give my condolences to the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham and say how good it is to see her back in her place. Mr. Speaker, Sophie Farrell was just 10 years old when she died in September. Childhood cancer is often described as rare, yet cancer is the biggest killer of children under 14. Sophie's GP failed to diagnose her cancer, and it was only when she went to A&E that they discovered the tumour in her little body that was 12 centimetres long. So, Mr. Speaker, on World Cancer Day on Friday, I would like to ask the Prime Minister to please advocate for more and better training for general practice to identify cancer in children.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable. I'm very sorry to hear of Sophie's case, and my thoughts are with her family and her friends. And she's right that research is crucial in tackling childhood cancers. That's why we're investing in more research. But it's also vital that we do tests and diagnostic scans and screens early enough, and that's why it's also important that NICE has not only updated its guidance on referring childhood cancers in February February last year, but we're investing in 100 new diagnostic centres in community hubs.
I now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that you and the rest of the House will want to join me in celebrating and supporting World Cancer Day. Mr. Speaker, just in relation to your earlier statement, I have a difficulty reconciling the Prime Minister's version of events with other evidence, and as you know, I have a duty to reflect and represent the deep, deep public anger with the Prime Minister. That said, Mr. Speaker, I respect the absolute impartiality that you take in your role, and I want to set on the record that I respect both you and the authority of the Chair. Mr. Speaker, this morning the Telegraph newspaper revealed that the Prime Minister attended a party in his flat on the 13th of November 2020. The Prime Minister previously told the House that no party took place. The police are now investigating this party, and we face a very real prospect of a sitting Prime Minister being questioned under caution and being fined in office. And if he is questioned, Mr. Speaker, he must go. If he's fined, he must resign. Mr. Speaker, you'll agree that the House should not be treated with contempt. So can the Prime Minister... here we go again. So can the Prime Minister update the House on his whereabouts on the evening of the 13th of November? Surely, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't need to wait for an investigation to tell us exactly where he was.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here we go again, says the right honourable gentleman opposite, and I must say those are entirely my feelings. He asked exactly the same questions as I recall in the chamber a few days ago. He knows, Mr. Speaker, that the process must go on, but I can tell him what's been going on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker. In November and throughout, we've been delivering the fastest vaccine and booster rollout anywhere in Europe. We've been getting people back into work, Mr. Speaker. We've been getting people back into work, Mr. Speaker, and we've been helping to bring the West together to defy what I think is completely unacceptable threats and intimidation from the Putin regime against Ukraine. And that's what we've been doing.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, that was a disgraceful response. And I have to say to the Prime Minister, he should read the room and he should see some of the faces on his colleagues' faces. He has lost it. Mr. Speaker, we've now reached the ridiculous scenario of a Prime Minister who can't even tell us where he was. He lives in a world where he thinks everything is owed to him, and he never pauses to think what he owes to the public. The Prime Minister is now a dangerous distraction at home and a running joke on the international stage. What does it tell the Prime Minister and the public that in the morning that he has returned from Ukraine, the chair of the Defence Select Committee has submitted a letter of no confidence in him?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it tells me that it is more vital than ever for the government of this country to get on with the job, deliver our COVID recovery plan, and that is what we are doing.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say thank you to the Prime Minister for visiting my Honest Mourne constituency, where he saw firsthand the enormous beneficial impact a new nuclear plant will know it could have if built on Anglesey. Nuclear power must play a role if we are to meet our carbon and net zero commitments, level up and combat rising energy prices. Does my right honourable friend agree that the rapid deployment of nuclear technology must be a priority for this government? And if so, will my right honourable friend commit to financing a nuclear plant at the Wilver site this Parliament?
Well, it was a great joy to visit my honourable friend's constituency, where I believe she is known as Atomic Kitten, or so she informed me, Mr. Speaker, and she outlined in great detail her plans for Wilfer. It's a fantastic vision, a fantastic site, and it remains a very interesting and attractive prospect for new nuclear power.
Colin Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if the Prime Minister has noticed, but while he's been partying, working families in Northern Ireland have lost £1,000 from their universal credit. Their national insurance has been put up by this government, and their energy bills are going through the roof. He's very fond of telling us that we're all in this together. Isn't it the truth, Mr. Speaker, that this Prime Minister has only ever been in it for himself and his rich mates?
No, Mr. Speaker, I'm in it to serve my country and the entire United Kingdom. And I'm also proud that we've had the biggest investment in Northern Ireland since devolution began, and we've cut taxation on universal credit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. South Western Railway has totally cut off Dorset, Somerset, most of Wiltshire and Devon from its direct rail services to London, as well as slashing our service in half, most of which is totally unnecessary. Will my right honourable friends support me and my neighbouring colleagues in getting direct services back to West Dorset and having a timetable that's fit for our region?
Prime Minister.
I want to thank my honourable friend very much for his question, and he knows whereof he speaks. He is an expert in this subject, Mr. Speaker, and he's lobbied very effectively for his constituents and reflected their frustrations. And I'm told that the timetable is expected to return to December 2021 levels from Saturday, the 19th of February.
Alex Sherville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was out this weekend speaking to a constituent who has a cold and leaky house. She has seen her bills already go up from £100 to £170 a month. The government have failed to insulate her house and failed to control her fuel bills. Bribing people with their own money is no plan. The Prime Minister has no plan to cut VAT, no plan to get the oil and gas industry to contribute. Another constituent who voted for the Prime Minister went further and called him despicable. What use is a Prime Minister who has no plan for families struggling with the cost of living and has lost the trust of the people of this country?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about cutting VAT. I wonder whether he voted for Brexit and our ability to cut VAT. Perhaps he could indicate. Perhaps he could indicate, Mr. Speaker, what we're doing, which we delivered, Mr. Speaker, and whose anniversary we celebrated on Monday. And what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is, and I sympathise very much with his constituent, and I understand the pressures that people are facing on the cost of living. But what we've got to do is invest in and then protect them, and we're putting £12 billion worth of support and financial help for families in hardship this year, and it's absolutely vital after the pandemic. But the most important thing is to have a jobs-led economic recovery. And in case I failed to make myself clear before you wound me up, Mr. Speaker, that's why we have the fastest economic growth in the G7.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Greater Manchester Mayoral Clean Air Zone scheme, effectively a congestion charge affecting all 500 square miles of Greater Manchester, including my constituents in Lee, is a job-destroying tax on ordinary workers.
Burnham's fault.
We all want clean air, but the model proposed by Mayor Burnham is unworkable and economically devastating. With charges of £60 per day per lorry driver. Taxis
white van men, even buses will be caught by it.
Typical Labour.
Will the PM intervene to prevent Mayor Burnham from inflicting this disastrous Labour scheme on Greater Manchester?
I know from my own experience how vital it is when you're trying to clean up air in a great city that you do not unjustly penalise business, and particularly small businesses. And it's become clear that the scheme proposed by the Labour Mayor in Manchester is completely unworkable, will do more damage to businesses and residents in Manchester. So we must find an alternative, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't punish local residents. And my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, will be saying more about this in the coming days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister receives a penalty fixed notice for attending a party or hosting a party during lockdown, will he inform the House and will he resign?
Yes. Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, of course I will comply with the law, but I've got to wait for the process to be concluded.
Ian Levy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since being elected, my fabulous constituency of Blythe Valley is really seeing the green shoots of prosperity. Government support is a green revolution in Blythe Valley. However, with such growth, the increased congestion on our roads, we are in desperate need of upgrades to the road infrastructure. Would my right honourable friend please meet with me to discuss the urgent problem and help Blythe Valley out of the ever-increasing traffic jam? Thank you.
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is the best champion that Blythe could possibly have. He does a quite amazing job, and I want to thank him in particular, Mr. Speaker, for helping to secure the British Volt Gigafactory in Blythe. Absolutely amazing investment, and I understand that, of course, growth and prosperity bring their challenges when it comes to congestion on our roads. We have to tackle that. We're working with the Council on a bid for the Blythe Relief Road, and I'll make sure that my honourable friend gets a meeting with the Transport Secretary to discuss it further.
Rachel Bascom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem with a distracted Prime Minister is that he makes the wrong choices. While he's been living it up, many of my constituents are living on the breadline as food, energy and taxes shoot up. In York, the rent prices are the highest now in the north and some of the highest in the country. And York is now in the top 10 places in the country where there is a cost of living crisis, pushing my constituents further into poverty and debt. So when is he going to stop protecting himself and start protecting my constituents?
So, Mr. Speaker, one of the first things I did when I became Prime Minister was to ensure that we looked after people on low incomes by increasing local housing allowance, Mr. Speaker, by increasing the living wage, not once but twice, and by record amounts, Mr. Speaker, and of course by doing what we've now done with universal credit. But the most important, I really think the House needs to get this, but the most important thing about the UK economy right now is that we have a strong jobs-led recovery, and that is what is going to drive up wages and drive up productivity and drive up growth, and that is what this government is delivering.
So Desmond Swain.
Will he brief us on his visit to Ukraine?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend very much, and in very briefly, Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House that the mission was to, as I hope everybody will support, was to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, for the House, for our country to show that we stand with the people of Ukraine and we stand for the sovereign and territorial integrity of Ukraine at a very difficult time, because there are on the borders of Ukraine, as everybody knows, about 125,000 Russian troops massing. The situation is very perilous. And the job of the UK is to lead the West in bringing together the most important countries in creating a package of economic sanctions that will deter President Putin from what I believe would be a disastrous miscalculation, and also to strengthen our support for the Ukrainian people and indeed the Ukrainian army. And we're doing that. We're supplying lethal but defensive weaponry as well as training to the Ukrainians. And that is greatly appreciated. But I must say that the situation remains risky, Mr. Speaker, and it is vital that diplomacy finds a way forward.
Thomas.
Mr. Speaker, on a related issue, after the publication of the Russia report, the Prime Minister claimed tackling illicit finance and driving dirty money and money launderers out of the UK is a priority. His warnings to Mr. Putin of late would surely have carried more bite if he'd actually used the 18 months since publication of the Russia report to legislate for an economic crime act to stop the flow of dirty money for Russia. Why hasn't he prioritised this issue of national security?
Mr. Speaker, contrary to some of the myths that are peddled, this government has come down very hard on dirty money from Russia and everywhere else. That's why we brought in the unexplained wealth orders and indeed China, Mr. Speaker, which they might like to consider. That's why we have sanctions on Russia following what they did in Crimea in 2014. We have Magnitsky sanctions on everybody involved in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. And to his point, Mr. Speaker, we are bringing forward the economic crime bill so that it will take place, it will be voted on in the third session of this Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the best efforts of the opposition, 2 years ago this week, this government delivered the democratic decision to leave the European Union. And despite there being a global pandemic in the 2 years since, over 70 free trade agreements have been signed. However, as we recover, there are many more opportunities that can be realised. So will the Prime Minister commit to appointing a minister responsible for realising those Brexit freedoms and benefits that will boost all of our constituencies?
Mr. Speaker, you can hear from the chuntering opposite that they still want to take this thing back. They still want to cancel Brexit, Mr. Speaker. But it was thanks to Brexit very largely that we had the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and we've been able to deliver our free ports, Mr. Speaker, and we've been able to do 60 or 70 free trade deals around the world. And yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to anticipate any decisions I may make about the government, but I certainly think it would be a good idea to have a minister driving that post-Brexit agenda.
Thank you. Let's just recap, Mr. Speaker. Before we were told we must wait for the Sue Gray report, then we were told we must wait for the police investigation to conclude. There was no party, and then if there was a party, I wasn't there. Then, well, if there was a party, then all rules were followed. But no one, Prime Minister, believes you. And if any of the above were true, why did Allegra Stratton have to resign?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I explained that sad matter on the floor of the House, and nobody wanted Allegra to resign. And I was very sad that she did.
Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Ginty Sheeran from Exmouth, has launched a campaign to get a dedicated menopause clinic in Devon. Women in East Devon currently face a 120-mile round trip to get to the nearest specialist menopause clinic. It's not good enough, is it?
No.
Will my right honourable friend outline what steps the government is taking to improve access to menopause services in Devon and the South West?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising this very important campaign, and we are committed to improving menopause care so that all women can have access to the support they need and to manage the symptoms. Menopause will be a priority within our women's health strategy, and we're committed to establishing a UK-wide menopause task force, Mr. Speaker.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister needs a Metropolitan Police inquiry to tell him whether he attended a party on the 13th of November in his own Downing Street flat, Why should we believe that he's a fit and proper person to have his hand on the button of our independent nuclear deterrent?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hesitate to remind the Right Honourable Lady, but she campaigned actively to install a Prime Minister who wanted to get rid of our nuclear deterrent altogether.
Mark Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, the Government and our NHS have done an amazing job with the vaccine rollout, making it a resounding success. Would my right honourable friend join me in thanking the wonderful NHS workers, volunteers and pharmacies who have worked so hard to help make this possible in Dewsbury, Mirfield, Kirkburn and Denbydale?
I thank my honourable friend, who does a fantastic job of representing his communities, and I want to thank all of them, Mr. Speaker, everybody involved in the rollout in Dewsbury, in Mirfield, in Kirkburton and in Denbydale, Mr. Speaker, because it was an extraordinary national effort, and anybody who visited a vaccine centre will know that feeling of pride in what was happening, that feeling of energy in a collective effort to make our society and our country literally healthier day by day. And I thank all of them, Mr. Speaker, from the bottom of my heart.
That's the end of PMQs. So those who wish to leave, please do so quietly and quickly. Very good. We now come to tributes to Jack Drum. Jack made his mark long before he came into this House, in particular as a fearless, energetic trade unionist. I remember campaigning with him in the 80s and the 90s to save the Royal Ordnance factory in Chorley. He was positive, down to earth and determined to help working with people, characteristics which remain with him and throughout his career. And I've got to say, somebody who knew Jack and worked with Jack, he was innovative, he was absolutely visionary, that we sat down upon a closure where thousands of jobs are going to go. And Jack said, we're in this together, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with the people whose jobs are at risk. And he said, we've got to look beyond what kills people. We can do something different. Let us look for alternatives that saves people's lives. The expertise that was in Royal Ordnance Chorley was second to none. Of course, we've got to fight for the jobs in the first place. It came a choice between Glascoid and Chorley. And Jack said, with the land values, we know where British Aerospace will be. But in the end, we came up with real alternatives. We'd seen the Lockerbie, we'd seen the destruction and the loss of life. And in Chorley, they designed a cargo that stopped the plane coming down. That was the vision of Jack, who said, if we can't save the jobs in making bombs, let us save jobs by finding an alternative to save life. So that's my personal experience of Jack Drummond. I knew him on other occasions, but I've got to say, he was inspirational to me, and he's been inspirational to many others in this House. Since his election to this House in 2010, he proved to be an exemplary member of Parliament. He was assiduous and effective campaigner for his constituents. As a frontbencher, he was trusted to lead for the party, in particular sensitive areas such as housing, policing, pensions, and most recently, immigration. While he was a robust frontbencher, he always demonstrated respect for his opponents and was well liked and admired across the House. Nobody could fall out with Jack Drummond. While we mourn a colleague, it is Jack's family who will, of course, feel the loss more deeply. I know the whole House will join me in expressing our condolences to the mother of the House, the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham. Harriet, I know that all members of this House will join me in saying to you and your family that we're so sorry for your loss. And it is a sad loss for this House. I will now take brief points of order to allow tributes from esteemed colleagues. I now call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 7th of January, this House suffered the loss of the Honourable Member for Birmingham and Erdington, Jack Dramey, and it is right that we should come together now in tribute to his memory. Let me offer my condolences on behalf of the whole government to the mother of the House, the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham, and her family. Although Jack and I may have come from different political traditions, I knew him as a man of great warmth and energy and compassion. And I can tell the House that one day Jack was driving, a very hot day, Jack was driving in Greece when he saw a family of British tourists, footsore, bedraggled, sunburned, with the children on the verge of mutiny against their father. And experience, I understand. And he stopped the car, Mr. Speaker, and invited them all in, even though there was barely any room. And I will always be grateful for his kindness, because that father was me, and he drove us quite a long way, Mr. Speaker. Jack had a profound commitment to helping all those around him and those he served. And he commanded the utmost respect across the House. He'll be remembered as one of the great trades unionists of our time, a veteran of the Grunwick picket lines, which he attended with his future wife, where they campaigned alongside the mainly Asian female workforce at the Grunwick Film Processing Laboratory. And having married someone who would go on to become, in his words, the outstanding parliamentary feminist of her generation, Jack became, again, in his words, Mr. Harriet Harman, née Dramey. He was rightly proud of the achievements of the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham. But we should also remember today his own contribution to this House during his 11 years as the member for Birmingham Erdington. He was a fantastic local campaigner who always had the next cause, the next campaign, the next issue to solve. And I was struck by the moving tribute from his son, Joe, who described how Jack was always furiously scribbling his ideas and plans in big letters on lined paper, getting through so much that when Ocado totted up their sales of that particular paper one year, they ranked Jack as their #1 customer across the whole of the United Kingdom. And he combined that irrepressible work ethic with a pragmatism and spirit of cooperation, Mr. Speaker, which you have just so well described. So Jack would work with anyone if it was in the interests of his constituents. As Andy Street, the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands, remarked, he was a great collaborator, always able to put party differences aside for the greater good. Birmingham has lost a dedicated servant, and we have all lost a generous, inclusive friend who set a fine example. So while Jack once said that he was born on the left and would die on the left, I can say that he will be remembered with affection and admiration by people on the right as well as the left, and in the middle, Mr. Speaker. And our country is all the better for everything he gave in the service of others.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the sudden passing of our friend Jack, tributes from every walk of life have captured the essence of the man we knew and loved. Larger than life, bursting with enthusiasm and ideas, and tireless in the pursuit of justice and fairness. Jack channeled all those attributes into representing the people of Erdington, a lifetime of campaigning for working people, and his greatest love, his family. The loss felt on these benches is great. The loss to public life, greater still. But the greatest loss is felt by another of our own, the member for Camberwell and Peckham. She and Jack were married the best part of 40 years ago. Now, the AGM of the Fulham Legal Advice Centre may not sound like the place to find romance. But that's where Jack and Harriet met. Jack addressing the meeting, and Harriet inspired to blaze a new trail, one that eventually led her to the place she holds today as an icon of the Labour Party and of this Parliament. When you hear Harriet talk about Jack, one word comes through time and time again: encouraged. It was Jack who encouraged her to join Brent Law Centre. It was Jack who encouraged her to stand as an MP, the first pregnant by-election candidate. It was Jack who encouraged her to run to be the Labour Party deputy leader. And when Harriet became the first woman in 18 years to answer questions at PMQs, it was Jack who sat in the visitors' gallery with their children, beaming down with love and admiration. And I'm so glad to see Jack's family here today, beaming down with the same love and affection and pride. The sense, Mr. Speaker, that Jack was always on your side is felt across this party and across the trade union movement. You can always get a measure of someone by how they treat their staff or those who rely on them. One of his former employees has said that whenever they met new people, he would always say that she was the real brains of the operation and he was merely the bag carrier. His humility, his sense of humour were legendary. Shortly after Harriet's book came out, a staffer had a copy of it on their desk. Jack roared with laughter as he saw a photo of himself in his 20s, Mr. Speaker, barely recognisable, with a prodigious thick beard. Good grief, he explained. What was Harriet thinking? What, putting the picture in the book? Replied the staffer. No, Jack said. Marrying me. I was fortunate enough to work alongside Jack when I was a new MP in 2015. And our friendship endured. And as I gave a speech in Birmingham just a few weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, it was Jack's face that I saw in the audience beaming up at me. He texted me the next day saying how much he'd enjoyed it. And that was 2 days before he died, which brings home the shock of his sudden, tragic passing. Jack cut his teeth as a campaigner who spoke truth to power. He picked battles on behalf of working people. Then he won them. It would be impossible to list all those victories today. He led the first equal pay strike after the Equal Pay Act was brought into law. He supported Asian women to unionise against a hostile management at Grunwick. And even this year, he campaigned for a public inquiry on behalf of COVID-bereaved families. Jack was a doughty campaigner, dubbed Jack of all disputes, feared by his opponents, but he was also deeply respected and liked across the political divide. Each and every one of us is richer for having known him. We will all miss him terribly. The funeral service on Monday was beautiful and moving. Today our hearts go out to Harriet, to Joe, Amy, Harry, and Jack's grandchildren. The loss and grief they'll be feeling cannot be measured or properly described. It can't be wished away or pushed down and ignored. Because great grief is the price we pay for having had love. We all love Jack, and even though he may no longer be with us here, that love will always live on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, can I say, through you and through the mother of Amy, Joe and Harry, that the personal was very well covered in St Margaret's 2 days ago. The political has been covered by the press and by Gordon Brown when he spoke at the service. I'd like to contribute a parliamentary word and a trade union one. The parliamentary one is that Jack show what can be achieved if by chance you can't have ministerial office during your time here. And for those who come here thinking being a minister is the only thing that matters, they're wrong. Secondly, I believe that if we could have more people who've had serious, continued trade union experience coming into this House, the House of Commons will be better for it. And I hope that won't just be on one side of the House.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over recent months, we've been forced to gather here far too often to remember colleagues who very sadly and very often suddenly been lost to this Parliament. Jack Dromey is another member of this House who has gone well before his time. On behalf of myself and my colleagues in the Scottish National Party, I want to extend our deepest sympathies who all knew and loved Jack. My thoughts, of course, are most especially with the Mother of the House. She has lost a constant companion who has been at her side all this time. She and the family bear the biggest burden of the loss of someone who was at the very centre of all their lives. I would also like to extend sympathy to Jack's beloved party, because we all know he was a Labour man through and through. I will also remember Jack as one of the fightiest campaigners in this place, a man rooted in trade union politics, rooted in the rights of workers, and a man who never lost an ounce of that spirit when he entered this Parliament. That fighting spirit extended to causes and campaigns far and wide, and I know that it extended to strikes and in protests in Scotland too. He was a true friend of Scottish workers and a champion of workers everywhere. Jack was true to the cause. That's probably why he was so good at working cross-party and winning support and friendship across this place. My friend, a former member of this place, Neil Gray, worked very closely on the pensions bill, and he still speaks so fondly about Jack's determination and his passion to make sure that that bill was amended. He would often bound up the stairs to my office to seek my and my party's support for various campaigns, not just for him, but for more often support for Harriet. Mr Speaker, I'll finish by sharing one story I read about Jack, which I thought was both very telling and very touching. Apparently, a few years ago, a great admirer of the Mother of the House from the feminist movement approached Jack and said, "I always feel a bit nervous around Harriet. I'm so in awe of her." Only for Jack to reply, "Me too." Even after all these years. Today, we can assure Jack and his family that many of us were in awe of him too. We deeply admired the way he conducted himself and the way that he carried himself every day of his life. He left his gentle mark on so many, and he will be greatly missed. And may he now rest in peace. God bless you, Jack.
I now come to Gail.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for allowing me exceptionally to speak from the front bench on what is a very difficult occasion. What an honour, my dear Jack, and what a sadness it is to speak of the friend I got to know from the other side of the aisle. For 3 years, Jack was the Shadow Pensions Minister. We became close. We would meet and talk and plan and sometimes agree to disagree, but always with equanimity. Politics is adversarial, heated. The media encourages, in fact demands of us, to be aggressive and mean-spirited. Jack did not play that game. Others have spoken of his decades of work for the union movement, of his being a loving father and a devoted husband, or even his management of truculent children on a deserted Greek road. What I want to talk about are two things. He is the best example I know in 11 years in the House of Commons of cross-party working. Many used to joke about how often I would exchange texts with Jack. We worked together and we got results. I would give him briefings on all future legislation, ongoing inquiries and difficult issues. Mr Speaker, that requires a lot of trust. And such trust can go wrong, as we all know. But he never used confidences unfairly or for quick political gain. I believe we and this House works better for such a thing. During the process of the Pension Schemes Bill, we spoke or sent text each other, I counted it up, over 110 times. Without his help, the bill, and particularly things like the collective defined contributions and the work with the Transport and General Workers Union, would not have happened as it did. And secondly, I want to talk of his kindness and generosity of spirit. My children died in childbirth in June 2020. And I want to share with the House about what he said when I tried to return to work, as we had 2 bills to do that autumn, and he saw I was struggling at this dispatch box on the 29th of June. He sent a text to me afterwards, and I wanted to share it with the House. Guy, I know we both have a job to do, but I was not comfortable today. I feel for you and your wife, my friend. We will build work around you. My thoughts are with you. Please take your time. Best wishes, Jack. Jack Dromey was, in my opinion, a man made in the Teddy Roosevelt spirit. Kind but combative, passionate but polite, always in the arena, always striving for the benefit of others, and there can be no finer compliment than saying that the man in the arena quote, which is my favourite, applies utterly and totally to him. Farewell, my friend. It was an honour to know you.
Yeah. Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My husband Henry first introduced me to Jack and Harriet when we got together in the 70s. We were, as ever, at some conference. Jack was, as ever, preoccupied with fixing some vote, and I was in total awe of Harriet and Jack. Fortunately, I got the seal of approval, and we've been friends now for nearly 50 years. Those who knew him well know what a generous, kind, funny, enthusiastic, interested and interesting, loyal, unselfish and consistent friend Jack was. Jack's life was filled by his total passion for social justice, his tribal loyalty to the Labour Party, his consummate determination to be at the heart of any and every campaign that might help to make the world a better place, and his relentless optimism that he would always win. Jack's life achievements were so many, his campaigns so eclectic, it's impossible to capture everything in a short tribute. I want to focus on his work before becoming an MP. From Granwick strike to fighting to maintain the Rosyth and Plymouth dockyards, from corralling the first ever equal pay strike at Trico, to observing the Luanda mercenary trials in Angola seeking to stop the execution of 3 British mercenaries, wherever there was injustice, Jack was there. I remember Jack in the 70s, leading the occupation of Centre Point in London, when London was littered with empty new office buildings while the homeless slept on the streets. I remember Jack in the 80s, when he bravely led the trade unions to oppose militant in Liverpool. In the 90s, when he served on Labour's NEC and worked to modernise the Labour Party and make us fit to govern. In the noughties, when he organised the cleaner strike here in Parliament when they were earning as little as £5 an hour. Finally, 2 personal memories. In all our fantastic, adventurous holidays together, whenever we arrived at a new destination, Jack's first question was always, "What's the Wi-Fi code?" He wasn't looking for a local restaurant. He wasn't finding a place for us to have a drink. His first priority was always, is everything okay in Erdington? And on New Year's Eve, we'd always have a sing-song, me playing the piano, everybody else singing. And each year, Jack, with his great singing voice, would give us a solo performance that harked back to his Irish roots of Danny Boy, with the women joining in to help him with a high note at the end. We always brought in the new year with our bang. Our grief at his loss is an expression of our love for the man. Jack will continue to live on in all our todays and tomorrows as we take forward the campaigns he worked on and enjoy the successes he achieved. Thank you, Jack, for everything and for just being you.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege and an honour to speak today about Jack, who I'm proud to call my friend and colleague in this place. He was my parliamentary neighbour as his constituency inside Birmingham City ran alongside the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, and there were many mutual issues affecting our constituents on which we worked seamlessly, constructively and enjoyably together. Jack's arrival in Birmingham was somewhat unexpected, not least because those of us keenly watching the outcome of the selection contest had been advised that this was an all-woman shortlist, but we quickly established a rapport. The thing I learnt early on about Jack was that he was a brilliant negotiator. Faced with a brick wall, his instinct was not to pound his way through it, but to skillfully manoeuvre round it wherever possible. And he was ineffably charming and patient. He had a considerable knack locally of bringing people of different persuasions to common positions. He did it at times of great anxiety in the automotive industry in the West Midlands with Caroline Spellman, our former colleague from Meriden, and with West Midlands Mayor Andy Street, and most recently with me working on Afghans coming to Birmingham from Kabul. All of which leads me, Mr. Speaker, finally to a story about Jack's negotiating powers, and forgive me for name-dropping, Mr. Speaker, about his relationship with the Marquess of Salisbury, a former colleague in this place, Conservative Minister, and member for Dorset South, Robert Cranborne. When his lordship was Minister for Defence, he held regular meetings with the unions in Whitehall. These meetings sometimes ran for 4 hours. Meaningful results were slow in being achieved, but during particularly drawn-out moments, the Marquess, as he is now, would catch the eye of the then senior trade union negotiator, as he then was, Jack Dromey. After one such meeting, his lordship rang up Jack to suggest that it would perhaps be better if they sorted out the business beforehand, possibly over lunch, and to Robert's relief, Jack willingly agreed. "Where should we go?" asked Jack, to which the Marquess replied, "I wonder if you might like to come to White's, my club in St James's," to which Jack replied, "I've always wanted to go there." And so affairs of state and the Ministry of Defence were congenially sorted out by these two distinguished public servants. On the first occasion, as various chiselled-featured members of the British establishment walked through the club's hallowed portals, Jack drank orange juice, but on the final occasion, after a particularly successful negotiation had been concluded, glasses of vintage port were consumed. And as he stepped out onto the street, Jack thanked his lordship for his kind hospitality, and as he left, over his shoulder said, "By the way, please don't tell Harriet where we've been." And especially, do not mention the vintage port. For the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, I can, of course, confirm that this was a workplace event. Mr. Speaker, as we remember an adopted son of Birmingham, taken from us far, far too soon, let us remember the words of Harry, Jack and Harriet's son, who with both sadness and pride spoke of the quality, but not, alas, the quantity of the years they all had together.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to add to these tributes already paid the profound sympathies of both myself but all the Liberal Democrats who sit on these benches. As a relatively new member of the Commons, I confess I didn't know Jack that well. But what I did know, I really, really liked. I first met him in a mindfulness meditation class that he, the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham, and I attended with other MPs as we sought to find some calm in the storm of the 2017-19 Parliament. I dare say, Mr. Speaker, it was at times hilariously awkward. And I remember Jack taking those classes with great humour. He oozed wisdom and kindness. And I think it was that shared experience that meant when we passed through the lobbies, we'd catch each other's eye, he'd ask me how I was, and he really meant it. And since his passing, I've learned that that kind man, who I liked so much, had that similar effect on pretty much everyone he met. The tributes today are proof of how respected he was across the whole political spectrum. And whilst a trade union man through and through, he was a pragmatist. He would work with anyone who could deliver his aims and shared his values. And part of his appeal and great strength was that he was so obviously driven by a deep desire to help people and also by his values. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, Jack Dromey was one of the good guys. I think it says it all that he worked to the last In that final debate on Afghanistan, he urged Parliament and the government to take a more compassionate approach to those in the world who need us the most. And in that final speech, he said, "Our country has a proud history of providing a safe haven to those fleeing persecution." And he spoke of our country's most fundamental values of decency, honesty, and fairness. Jack embodied those values. To the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham, and to their children, Harry, Joe, Amy, and the whole family, there are no words. But I hope that in today's tributes, they can take some comfort in knowing the impact that Jack had and how he affected not just this House, but the whole country.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Jack made a big impression as soon as he was elected to this place. In 2010, when he first came, he was appointed straight away to the front bench, and I was a rookie minister in the government, and he was appointed my shadow. I have to say this was a forbidding prospect, because Jack came with such a reputation, as the Leader of the Opposition attested to, of one of the big trade union leaders of his day, used to rallying mass meetings and getting his own way. So it was with a little trepidation that I committed myself to many days, in fact weeks, in the Localism Bill committee, going head to head on this. But I was quickly to discover that Jack's success was based, as has been evidenced today, on his charm, his persuasion, and his very detailed and forensic mind. And he made a tremendous impact as we spent those many weeks together. In fact, so persuasive was Jack's oratory and his work in the committee that he incited my very first rebellion. And this was as the minister taking the bill through the committee, to the consternation of the whips, when his remarks were so persuasive that I could find no argument against the amendment he was putting forward, and declared that I would accept it. And we did, despite the fact that, as former ministers and indeed current ministers will know, that my speaking notes had in bold type and in capitals, resist to the amendment being said. So it is fair to say, it is objective to say that, that Jack's powers were simply, literally irresistible. Going on from that, my right honourable friend, member for the Royal Town of Sutton Coldfield, attested to Jack's brilliant work in forging alliances irrespective of party. He mentioned the work that he did with our former right honourable friend, Dame Caroline Spellman, his constituency neighbour. And they stood up in particular for manufacturing industry, interests that created jobs in their constituencies and across the West Midlands. And that joint work was vital during turbulent times when investment decisions were being considered, and to show the unity of purpose of the local MPs projected nationally was very important. Jack's lifetime of knowledge, experience and passion for manufacturing industry made him an authority carrying universal respect and the confidence of employers creating jobs. And so I was honoured when Jack asked me, after Caroline stepped down at the last election, to continue that partnership with him. And we met regularly with businesses and trade union leaders, not only in his beloved automotive sector, but also in aerospace, chemicals, life sciences and food and drink. And he is greatly missed by the leaders of those sectors. Ministers from the front bench and my honourable friend for Hexham, as well as the Prime Minister, have attested to what an effective advocate Jack was. But he achieved what he did through kindness, through enthusiasm, through optimism and encouragement, but not without drawing on his trade union skills of organisation and tenacity. His achievements and how he won them made him respected across this House and across the country. He does represent, as does the Right Honourable Lady, the very best of this House.
Crier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I'm just sorting out my glasses, which have become entangled in my mess. Can I start by saying that how great it is to see the mother of the house, our inspiration, Harriet, in the chamber today, along with her family. I knew Jack for years and years. We worked together. I could speak probably for the next 2 hours about all the campaigns we worked on. First as T&G officers in Transport and General Workers Union, then as MPs we were elected here at the same time. But there's a couple of campaigns that I want to talk about particularly. And the first one is, many people in this chamber will remember the campaign when Kraft took over Cadbury's. 7 factories were taken over by Kraft. And Jack led the trade union campaign to protect the jobs. A very successful campaign, by the way. And as part of that campaign that I got involved with in Jack's behest, we went to see the then business secretary, Peter Mandelson. But before the meeting, and this is just the sort of thing Jack would do, Jack discovered that Peter's favourite chocolate was fruit and nut. So we got a cardboard box roughly the size of Westminster Abbey. And we filled it with Cadbury's fruit and nut before we had this very, very constructive and successful meeting. I wonder why it was so constructive and successful with Peter Mandelson. Although I have to add that I remember before we went in, I remember saying to Jack, Peter's quite a lean sort of bloke. He obviously looks after himself. Do you think some of that chocolate might be surplus to requirements? So by the time we got into the meeting, the box was a bit lighter than was originally the case. The second campaign, and again it was successful, actually even more successful, was the campaign which is largely now forgotten, involving S&A Foods. Bear in mind the name S&A Foods, because that's going to be important. S&A were a big agricultural combine, largely producing strawberries, about 30% of the British strawberry market. And its workers were largely migrants, very badly exploited. And when I say a big workforce, I'm talking 4,000 to 5,000 people working on the land in the West Country picking strawberries, but just for 3 months a year, and very badly treated. Jack got involved in that campaign, as he always did. He threw everything, he worked his heart out on getting recognition, on getting better terms and conditions, and actually improving the lives of those thousands of people working on the land. And that became quite a big deal at the time. And I can remember Jack and I going to a meeting of Transport and General Workers members afterwards, and officers. And Jack always had about 50 things going on in his brain at the same time. You know, that's just the way he was. So as he rose to speak to the members, he wasn't really concentrating on his words. And he opened his speech by saying, right, what I want to talk to you now about is S&M. You could see all these pretty traditional, for those of you that knew the T&G, pretty traditional trade unionists, their faces dropping and going, what? And I was nudging Jack, saying, Jack, it's S&A, it's not S&M. That's something entirely different. I think. As I said at the beginning, I could talk at great length about all the campaigns I did together with Jack, and he was always an inspiration. He always led from the front, and he was very, very largely successful. I mean, he was one of the most successful trade union officers industrially that we've seen in the past probably 50, 60 years, something like that, and very often in difficult conditions. And there was one overriding aim that Jack had, and that was to improve the conditions and the lives of the people he and we represented. And in that, I think he was successful. And in that, I think he left the world better than he found it.
Mr. Crouch.
Mr. Speaker, I don't remember the first time I met Jack, but I think that's probably because when I did, I walked away feeling like I'd known him forever. He was gentle, sweet, and naturally mindful, by which I mean that unlike some colleagues, his eyes weren't darting around to see if there was someone more interesting or important to speak to. If you had his attention, you held his attention. To me, he was always so kind. He never defined me by my politics or my football team, but as a person. He always asked about my family, and whenever we had a conversation about my son Freddie, he would then regale me of tales and the occasional picture of his grandchildren, accompanied by a beaming smile and sparkling eyes. His adoration for his family was clear to see. Jack was exceptionally polite. Like a child who can spot an ice cream shop from a mile away, Jack, it seems, could spot a colleague who needed a confidence boost. He always had a word of praise for anyone downhearted about their performance in this place. A cheeky well done, a smile as you sat down, a kind tribute in his own comments. He was quite simply a lovely colleague. Now, I'm sure he was prone to arguing with the sat-nav or left his shoes in a perilously dangerous place, but from the outside, he looked like a pretty perfect husband. One who loyally and lovingly supported his wife at a time when Parliament was even more challenging for women than it is today. And I hope most of us think we have a Jack at home, but I still reckon he could have made a fortune giving consultancy on how to be the long-suffering but supportive male other half. This house has lost someone special, but my heart doesn't break for us. It breaks for the Right Honourable Lady for Camberwell and Peckham, his 3 children and grandchildren, and as I sit down and remember his warmth and gentleness, I send my love to them today.
Yeah. Jim Shelton.
It's a pleasure to add a contribution from my own party. Can first of all apologise. The Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley is unable to be here. He lost his brother last week and the funeral was yesterday. So on behalf of my party, I wish to make some comments. First of all, when I came to this house in 2010, I had some relationships and experience in the council and also in the assembly, but I knew this was a bigger place and more MPs and more people. So you look about and you know who do you watch to learn the ropes and of the trade. And well, Jack Dromey was one of those people you looked at because he was a man that, from my opinion, whenever he spoke, Mr. Speaker, if you were leaving the chamber, you sat down because you wanted to hear what he was going to say. That was the sort of gentleman that he was. My last engagement with him, Mr. Speaker, would have been in Westminster Hall. That would be a surprise to people. I was in Westminster Hall. but I was. And on that day, Jack Dromey was there as a shadow spokesperson to speak on the Afghan Citizen Resettlement Scheme. We had a very good debate and a good response from the Minister. And afterwards, as I always do, and others do as well, Mr. Speaker, I went up and I thanked him for his contribution. It was a significant contribution on a subject that he loved and he wanted to add to. And I thanked him for his contribution, and he in turn thanked me for the backbench committee, give us the privilege of the debate, but thanked me for at least requesting it. So those are the questions, and that hard to believe that was on the 6th of January, yeah. And less than some 18 hours later, I got a message from the girl in my office to tell me that Jack had passed away. I said, no, you got it wrong. I seen him yesterday. I couldn't be right. But unfortunately, it was, Mr. Speaker, and it was right. So Jack Dromey was a man of strong principles and devotion to service, and indeed his legacy of a fighting spirit and relentless optimism is something which each of us on these benches can and should aspire to. Jack, I feel, was a master of all campaigns. If he was campaigning for it, be on his side, because that was a winning side to be on. And we are in every section of this House, on this side and across the floor, on the poor for his absence. So my thoughts and my prayers are with his family, with Harriet, our friend and colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham, and the children at this time, as they face the oncoming days, as they will, but with fantastic memories, without this wonderful man so suddenly taken from us all. So, Mr. Speaker, I am sure that you will agree that the message to be sent to his family today is that you're not alone with your grief, and that this House, this great family of MPs and staff, are united behind you. Thank you.
Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one could fail to have been moved on Monday by the incredible tributes to Jack from his 3 children, to Harry, Joe and Amy. We know, all of us, the pride that Jack had in his family, but we felt it too on Monday for Jack, and also their pride in him as well. Jack had that wonderful way of making you feel that everything was going to be all right. Didn't matter what scrapes he had got you into, it was all going to be okay. And I was lucky to work with Jack on so many campaigns, and he was just formidable on so many different things. If we despaired, he always had some good new idea to pick us up, and then he'd be off running with it, and we would be racing to catch him up. If we got too highfalutin, he would remind us what they were saying in The Dog and Duck. If we faltered, as all of us do from time to time, he would be there to tell us we were brilliant and not to lose faith. And he was a fabulous feminist. And we all saw the support that he gave to Harriet over so many decades. We heard from Amy, Jack's daughter, on Monday that true feminism at home meant also making sure that Harriet never had to learn how to use a washing machine. And I have to say, I was so proud when I heard that, as somebody who first has known Harriet and Jack since I was in my 20s and has avoided wherever possible using the washing machine at home, resolutely refused to learn to cook. But I would say to Amy that you got me into a bit of trouble on Monday because Ed, who was sitting next to me, just turned and glowered at me and said, so it was all Jack and Harriet's fault. But I say I learnt from the very best. Because what Jack did was, he didn't just support Harriet, he supports so many of us as women parliamentarians, women in the trade union movement as well. And one woman trade unionist said to me, Jack had encouraged her when she was a young mum many years ago to put herself forward in the trade union movement. And that would have been pioneering enough at that time. But what he also did was he spied her husband standing at the back holding their child, went to find him and to tell him what an incredibly important and noble job he was doing in supporting her too. And he also had that amazing special ability to bring people together at a time when politics can feel so divided. We heard how when he died, he had tributes from the 5 biggest manufacturing groups in Britain and also the 5 biggest trade unions, a unique reflection of the industrial alliance he had worked so hard to bring together. And in the Labour movement, he didn't just straddle the left-right divide, he also had strong roots in both our liberal and our communitarian traditions. Unusually, he had his politics and values throughout his life bound together that fierce support for equality, for feminism, for anti-racism, for individual rights, but also that deep roots in community solidarity, in family, and in faith in the dignity of work. And he brought that together, and we need more Jacks. I was with Jack the afternoon before he died, and every conversation I had with him that day was just pure Jack. There was something I doubted that I'd done that he said was brilliant, even though I'm sure it wasn't. We talked about Christmas, and he said how wonderful his grandchildren were. And then he went on in Parliament to speak in the debate and make a passionate and patriotic case for the government to do the right thing by vulnerable Afghan refugees. And as a last act in Parliament, it was entirely fitting, and that demonstration of his persistent decency and solidarity. But most of all, Jack was an optimist. He loved life and he loved people, and he made lives better because he believed things could be better. And so many of us have learnt so much from Jack that we will make sure that legacy carries on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jack Dromey was my mentor, my teacher, my political partner, and my friend for almost a decade and a half in Birmingham. Like many of us here today, he was like a father to me. Indeed, he was at school with my dad at Cardinal Vaughan in West London, part of that extraordinary generation of second-generation Irish kids, sharp, chippy, pushing, determined to make a contribution to social justice. Didn't always start smoothly. My godfather, Spud Murphy, then a prefect at Cardinal Vaughan, used to talk to me fondly about having to give Jack a clip round the ear for smoking behind the bike sheds at school. But Jack was not a rebel without a cause. His cause was social justice. He fought for it his entire life. His glorious life was one long crusade for the underdog. He fought for them whenever and wherever he found them. His campaigns in Birmingham are innumerable. He fought for more police numbers. He fought for COVID families. He fought for the food bank. He fought for Erdington High Street. He fought for manufacturing jobs. He fought for the factory at GKN, and this was all just in the last week of his life. Mr. Speaker, Jack brought a particular approach, as you know, sir, to all of his campaigns. It generally started with a very, very long list of bullet points. And Jack would start off by saying, just 3 points, and we would tease him as he got to, and 17thly, but he brought to every single one of his campaigns what he used to fondly say was a certain je ne sais quoi. He made sure that at the core of every single one of his campaigns were the stories, because we have all been educated in the legend, which is Joe and Josephine Soap in The Dog and Duck in Erdington. He brought to all of his campaigns not just that art of coalition building, but that incredible calm along with the persistence. He used to very proudly say that his nickname in the union was Never Snap, Never Flap Jack. And he used to remind me of that very often as I was losing my rag over the last year and a half. On the last day of Jack's life, we were working together on a book which is about the future of our great region, the heart of Britain. And as ever, he brought to that an extraordinary optimism. He'd put the Green Industrial Revolution actually at the core of what he wrote. This is what he wrote, Mr. Speaker. I am passionate in my belief that change is possible. However, my experience as an MP for a constituency with high levels of inequality and poverty, it is crucial that any change is not just ambitious in the objective of dealing with climate change, but radical in creating opportunity for all. There is much to do and little time to achieve it before it's too late. I say to the mother of the house and the family watching today, like you, we have all struggled with the shock of loss. I myself have found comfort in the words not of an Irish poet, but of a Greek who wrote centuries ago. Even in our sleep, pain falls drop by drop upon the heart, and in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. The wisdom that we draw from Jack Dromey's life is very simple. We should all try and be more Jack. Our community, our country, and this House of Commons will be a damn sight better for that.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to follow my colleague and friend from Birmingham. And I think that what I want to say is going to be all about Birmingham. And Jack doesn't sound like me. He wasn't groomed as I was, like a child loves their parents no matter what. I love Birmingham because it was given to me at birth. But Jack didn't have that, and he loved it way more than me. He would talk about Birmingham in terms that made it unrecognisable to me. Now, I love the place, don't get me wrong. But Castle Vale, whilst I love it, is not a great place of beauty. The Aston Expressway is not a thing to behold. And yet, when Jack talked about Birmingham and talked about Brummies, he felt so much as if he was from the tradition of the place of my birth. And I think much of that is to do with his Irish ancestry, which so many of us in Birmingham have. But there could be no greater advocate for the city of Birmingham. I know there are many people who want to speak, and so I shall just touch slightly as well on not only Jack being an honorary Brummie, and not even honorary, Jack Dromey was a Brummie, through and through, without question, but also being an honorary sister.